We we have a lot of alumni speakers here today, and we're very happy to welcome everybody back. We also have some new people, and we're happy to welcome them here for the first time. Mark has been affiliated with this, I believe, almost since day one. We're really happy to have Mark here in person this year. I've always been really impressed with Mark's ability to juxtapose themes from the space race era of the 60s and 70s with our world, the race for the checkered flag, and our interest in land-based speed. I think it was at one of Mark's talks, and Mark, if I got this wrong, just please tell me I got it right. But I think I learned at one of Mark's talks a few years ago, the original 7 Apollo astronauts were all given Chevy Corvettes by Chevy, so America's space heroes were driving around in America's sports cars. Pretty cool marketing gimmick on the part of Chevy.
Yeah, they were given $1 a year leases on brand new Corvette Stingrays.
They weren't free. Okay, I knew there was.
Well, actually, the lease deal was for 2 cars. Each astronaut could lease 2 cars. So what they did is the astronauts leased Corvettes for themselves. They usually got something more of a family grocery getter for their wives, and then they would go out and tear the cars up. And after a year, they would trade them in, get another Corvette, and the dealer, who was Jim Rathman, who was the 1960 Indianapolis 500 winner,
right.
He would then resell the cars as used, but he could put the caveat that this was a car that Alan Shepard owned. This is a car that Scott Carpenter owned, and that put the value up. So
okay. That's cool. All right, so I got that basically right.
Yeah.
Anyway, Mark's going to do the same again this year, only he's going to focus, I believe, on the year 1965. So please welcome Mark Howell.
Thank you. It's good to be here. This project is an ongoing project. I'm working on a book manuscript right now that is juxtaposing, as Kip was saying, kind of the connection between motorsports and space exploration, because there is a connection. And as a kid who grew up wanting to both be a race car driver and an astronaut and couldn't quite determine which of the two was going to win, it was to my surprise that I noticed as I got older and became a cultural historian and started in academia that there was a connection between the two. So today this is an ongoing sort of part of that research. And the reason I selected 1965 in part is because this year is kind of significant. I mean, if you think about it, this is the 75th anniversary of what we know as Formula One. It's the 75th anniversary of the Wood brothers getting into racing. So you've got these different kinds of anniversaries that kind of pop up around this year. And 60 years ago, it seemed like there was a lot going on, both in space exploration and motorsports, things that were going on that ended up sort of setting the course for the future of both occupations and both endeavors. So that's where this comes from. So with that, let us proceed. The year 1965 stands out as a turning point in American technological and cultural history. In both space exploration and in motorsports, 2 fields that are often seen as unrelated, but they are connected. You had engineers, astronauts, drivers, and institutions that were simultaneously pushing the boundaries of speed, endurance, and human capability. It was a moment when advances in materials, design, and engineering converged with national ambition. It was also the year I was born. And I haven't changed much. So I still lean forward, and I'm still kind of round in the face, but so that's me. I can vouch that's me. While these events meant nothing to me at the time, they have become meaningful through what was recorded, remembered, and retold. Looking back across 6 decades, I propose we understand 1965 not merely as a collection of milestones, but as a year whose significance is shaped by collective memory. This kind of gets to what Jim was talking about in his talk here a little bit ago. using the frameworks of societal logics and cultural identity, I submit that the narrative constructed around 1965, stories of innovation, competition, and national purpose, continue to shape how we understand the relationship between technology and culture. When examined through this lens, 1965 becomes more than a year of achievements. It becomes a cultural touchstone that reveals how societies make meaning from historic, competitive, and technological triumphs. As 1965 began, the United States was in the midst of the space race, running second to the Soviet Union in placing satellites and animals in low Earth orbit. America was also chasing the technological and ideological target set by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 of landing a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And I'll admit to you right now, the first part of my presentation is going to be kind of space heavy. But then, after setting the stage, pardon the pun, stage, rockets, stages, then we'll move into motorsports. So, whoops, there we go. Okay. NASA was caught off guard when, on April 12th, 1961, Yuri Gagarin made a 108-minute flight aboard his Vostok 1 spacecraft, scoring two monumental firsts for the Soviet Union, the first human in space and the first human to orbit the Earth. In 1963, Russia's Valentina Tereshkova made 48 orbits over 3 days to become the first woman in space. And as a point of comparison, the first American woman in space was Sally Ride 20 years later in June of 1983. In 1965, Project Gemini tightened the space race by demonstrating the versatility and technology needed to reach the moon. Not that Gemini got off to a rousing start. An article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists highlighted a rift between the US military and NASA because the agency, according to some people, was more interested in landing on the moon than developing America's military capability in space. Some believed, and this was precisely the case, this is what the Soviet Union was doing with their vehicles. So the rift was actually pretty well-meaning. I mean, we weren't spying like the Soviet Union was using their technology to do. Now, that said, astronauts had been photographing the Earth since John Glenn took a store-bought Minolta point-and-shoot camera into orbit on Friendship 7 in 1962. While American spaceflight was seen as more scientific than spying, there were some in the federal government who thought manned missions were missed opportunities to observe America's enemies from afar. The United States Air Force was, in fact, working with McDonnell Aircraft, adapting Gemini hardware to develop a manned orbital laboratory that would conduct essential research, as long as that essential research meant spying on other countries. The project stalled in 1966 as satellite technology was improving and funds were needed to fund the war in Vietnam. All the while, the Soviet Union fully believed it was capable of beating NASA to the cratered lunar finish line. The Soviets upped the lunar ante in March with Alexei Leonov's surprise 13-minute extravehicular activity, a move that forced NASA to fast-track an American response. The first American EVA was scheduled for Gemini 5 later in the year, but Russia's awkward yet successful, and I say awkward because when Leonov got out in the vacuum of space, his pressure suit inflated. And for a while, they weren't sure how to deflate it enough to get him back through the hatch. There was a period of time when they thought they would just have to cut him loose because he was essentially the Michelin Man in space, and they had to figure out a way to get him back. But they did. So, but anyway, his early spacewalk led the agency to assign America's first EVA to Gemini 4, only the second manned flight of the program. Astronaut Edward White was assigned to conduct the spacewalk in early June. On the second orbit of Gemini 4's 66 orbit flight, Commander James McDivitt assisted White in opening his hatch, allowing White to float free of his spacecraft, tethered by a 15-foot umbilical cord that provided communications and life support. White spent 23 minutes in space, taking photographs and creating optics that, unlike Leonov's EVA, would promote Gemini 4's accomplishment throughout the world. More than a technical demonstration, Ed White's EVA quickly became a cultural moment. The image of an American astronaut floating freely against the blackness of space, tethered only by a lifeline, offered the nation a powerful symbol at a moment when Cold War anxieties were high. And also a side note, this is the first mission where astronauts wore the American flag on their spacesuits. And that was actually at the bequest of McDivitt and White. They kind of knew that this was going to be a big moment for the United States. And so they went ahead and said, hey, can you put the American flag on our spacesuits? And NASA didn't stay with that, but if you look at the majority of spacesuits from this point on, you see an American flag. Oh, excuse me as I kick this thing here. Gemini 5, flown in August by Gordon Cooper and Charles Pete Conrad, who were, by the way, recognized outside the space program as both being competitive racers in their own right. Cooper raced sports cars and hydroplane boats, and Pete Conrad raced sports cars with the SCCA, and he actually raced at Watkins Glen at least one time back in the early 70s. Their mission, Gemini 5, was to be the first spacecraft to use fuel cells instead of batteries as a source of external power, or internal power, excuse me. Cooper and Conrad described their mission as 8 days in a garbage can, since their sole purpose was to live in Earth orbit and demonstrate that fuel cells could generate enough energy for a minimum duration lunar mission. They also had the EVA taken away from them, so they were kind of frustrated at that. They would also test a new radar technology that enabled vehicles to rendezvous in orbit with great precision, which was another critical aspect of going to the moon. Cooper and Conrad, being racers in their own right, commented on how loud and fast the Titan II launch vehicle was, which was understandable given that Gemini crews went into space atop an ICBM designed to carry nuclear weapons. Astronauts compared the Titan II to a sports car, maybe a Corvette Stingray. I don't know, that's what they were driving, given its quick and steady acceleration, which interestingly enough led to a sharp change in trajectory at a particular altitude that aimed the vehicle toward Russia. So what the astronauts had to learn to do was to counter that change in trajectory, because that wasn't their intent, at least in the Gemini program. Gemini 5 ultimately earned the United States a new flight duration record of 7.96 days in orbit, exceeding cosmonaut Valery Bukovsky's record by 72 hours. The flight duration record of Gemini 5 was shattered 4 months later in December by Jim Lovell and Frank Borman on Gemini 7, when they spent 13.77 days in orbit. This mission was the most ambitious of 1965 and probably of the entire Gemini program. It included a pretty big to-do list. The astronauts were going to spend 2 weeks in space. They were going to try new extra lightweight spacesuits, which you can see here. They're almost like kind of, their helmets are like almost like big bags they're wearing over their heads, and executing a controlled re-entry near their recovery location. Borman and Lovell were also tasked to complete, and this is a direct quote from NASA, 3 scientific, 4 technical, 4 spacecraft, and 8 medical experiments. The medical experiments involved Frank Borman going into space with electrodes stuck in his skull under his helmet to get physiological data on their condition. Gemini 7 became part of an unplanned exercise when Gemini 6, an unmanned rendezvous target vehicle, was lost after liftoff, which delayed the launch of Gemini 6A, which was going to meet up with the target vehicle. Gemini 6A, which was going to carry astronauts Tom Stafford and Wally Schirra. NASA planners suggested that Gemini 7 lift off before Gemini 6A so the two vehicles could attempt a manned rendezvous, which would be necessary for a lunar mission. In December 1965, NASA achieved the incredible. Two Gemini spacecraft, one piloted by Indy team car owner Wally Schirra, by the way. He was a silent partner with A.J. Foyt. Actually, in 1967, their car finished second, at Indianapolis with Joe Leonard behind the wheel. But Wally Schirra got the spacecraft together. They did kind of a side drafting sort of a thing. They got to within 3 feet to actually at one point they got to within 1 foot of each other at 17,500 miles an hour for 5.5 hours at an altitude of 160 nautical miles. The astronauts could see each other. They could read signs held up to windows. This is a dig at this is the crew of Gemini 7. They were both naval, one was Air Force, one was Navy, but they held up the sign for, it was the Army-Navy game was coming up. So you see it's a Beat Army sign in the window. And they were able to visually inspect the condition of both spacecraft. It was a technological achievement that gave 1965 added historical significance. Just as NASA rushed to match Soviet achievements through technical improvisation, motorsports organizations in 1965 faced parallel pressures, organizational, cultural, and technological, that shaped their own collective narratives. Take NASCAR, for example. By 1965, American automakers were focused on engine development and horsepower. NASCAR, on the other hand, stuck to its 1949 notion of showroom stock cars, and the slogan, "Win on Sunday, sell on Monday." Another factor was the sanctioning body's homologation rules, requiring manufacturers to produce a specific number of high-powered creations for commercial sale. Many of these specialty engines, like the 426 Hemi, which you see here, Ford's 427 Cammer, and GM's 427 Mark II, were simply not available in showrooms. In October of 1964, NASCAR founder Bill France announced that, in 1965, all engines used in competition had to meet strict guidelines limiting their displacement, among other restrictive measures meant to govern on-track performance. While manufacturers wanted to park their big engines in victory lane, Big Bill France wanted stock cars to carry stock motors available to consumers. During the 1964 NASCAR season, Chrysler and Ford repeatedly criticized each other's creative engineering efforts while addressing NASCAR rule changes meant to level the high-banked playing field. It was Chrysler's 426 Hemi that received the most public attention. Hemispherical combustion chambers were nothing new in 1964 and 1965. They were actually developed by Chrysler for the P-47 Thunderbolt in World War II. But World War II ended before the design could be put into production. This technology led to the development of the 426 Hemi, which Big Bill France banned from competition in late 1964. Chrysler's Hemi allowed Richard Petty to dominate the Grand National division earlier in 1964, winning his first Daytona 500 and his first Grand National title with 9 victories and 43 top 10s for 61 starts in a Plymouth Belvedere powered by the now outlawed in 1965 by NASCAR 426 Hemi engine. As such, the Chrysler Corporation took extreme measures. After Chrysler announced it would boycott the 1965 NASCAR season, Richard Petty went racing with the National Hot Rod Association, driving a Petty Enterprises prepared Hemi-powered Plymouth Barracuda. Given Petty's national fame and competitive dominance in 1964, he was usually matched against a full-time drag racer. He ran against such NHRA regulars as Don Nicholson and Ronnie Sox, and they were pretty much more like celebrity shootouts than elimination heats that you would see in competition. Petty's 1965 drag racing sabbatical was marred, tragically, in late February when a component in the left front of his Plymouth failed during a race at Southeastern International Dragway near Dallas, Georgia. The car careened through a chain-link fence, went into the crowd. It injured 7 spectators and took the life of 6-year-old Wayne Edward Dye. Petty Enterprises then built a second Hemi-powered Barracuda, which carried Richard to an NHRA Spring Nationals win at Bristol Motor Speedway in 1965. Chrysler's boycott of the 1965 NASCAR Grand National season worked to the Ford Motor Company's advantage. Illinois native Fred Lorenzen led 25 of 133 laps to win the rain-shortened Daytona 500 in a top 11 sweep by Ford products. Lorenzen also won both Grand National races at Charlotte in 1965. The day of my birth, by the way, was well-timed and conveniently sandwiched between Fred Lorenzen's win at Martinsville on 4/25, April 25th, that's the day before I was born, and then Tiny Lund drove a Ford to victory at Columbia, South Carolina on April 28th. And in the middle was me. Chrysler's NASCAR boycott ended in late July of 1965 when the company met those homologation guidelines. Chrysler's first 1965 Grand National win came when Richard Petty won at Nashville in a 1965 Plymouth. The damage, however, had already been done. Ned Jarrett won the 1965 Grand National Championship with 13 wins in 54 starts in a Ford, while Fred Lorenzen ended the year 13th in points with 4 wins in only 17 starts. Ford easily won the 1965 Manufacturers' Championship with 50 victories in 55 races. One of the 50 wins, interestingly enough, was by Curtis Turner, who returned from his 4-year NASCAR-induced suspension. He was suspended by Bill France for trying to bring organized labor, bring the Teamsters in to organize NASCAR, NASCAR drivers at least. And so he returned from his sabbatical, shall we say, to win the very first Grand National race held at Rockingham Speedway, and that was on October 31st in 1965. No discussion about the Ford Motor Company and 1965 would be complete without mention of that year's Indianapolis 500. The 1965 Indy 500 was a perfect storm as Scotsman Jim Clark dominated the race in his Lotus 38, a streamlined, lightweight monocoque chassis designed by Colin Chapman, who was an aviation engineer at one point, and Len Terry. The car was engineered with an offset suspension and powered by a mid-mounted 4.2-liter double overhead cam Ford V8. The Lotus 38 was based on the Lotus 29 that finished second at Indy with Jim Clark in 1963, and the Lotus 34 that finished 17th at Indy with Dan Gurney in 1964. Jim Clark and his Lotus 38 averaged 150.686 miles an hour to win at the Brickyard, breaking the 150-mile-an-hour barrier, as well as A.J. Foyt's 1964 record of 147.35. In the final Indy 500, won by a front-engine car. By the way, 64 was the last front-engined win. Only 6 front-engine cars were on the grid in 1965, making it the first Indianapolis 500 to feature mostly rear-engined entrants. Teams at Indianapolis in 1965 faced new rules in response to the tragic events of 1964. If you remember, that's when Dave McDonald and Eddie Sachs died in that fiery wreck right near the start of the race. These new rules included a new minimum weight restriction and new guidelines for fuel management, guidelines that required cars to have a 75-gallon onboard capacity, fuel tanks with rubber bladders, and no crossover tubes located in front of the driver. Teams at Indy in 1965 were encouraged to run methanol, which made more horsepower even though gasoline provided better mileage. That said, teams were now required by the rules to pit at least twice and to connect to their newly required, another new rule, gravity-fed fueling rigs, which eliminated any advantage to be had by running gasoline. The 1965 Indy 500 featured one of the largest and most impressive rookie classes in the event's history, a roster that included Mario Andretti, Gordon Johncock, Joe Leonard, and Al Unser. The front row was comprised of A.J. Foyt, who qualified with a new track record. I don't say it quite the way as Tom Carnegie used to, but Jim Clark was second, and Dan Gurney on the outside of row one. Andretti was the fastest rookie, starting fourth on the grid. When it comes to the 1965 Indy 500 and the influence of collective memory, the story of the Wood brothers comes to mind. Popular meaning comes from our memories of the famous NASCAR pit crew servicing Jim Clark's Lotus en route to victory at the Brickyard. Despite such memories, fact over fiction suggests the Wood brothers were more of a Ford public relations stunt than a competitive necessity. Teams at Indy knew the Wood brothers and their reputation in NASCAR, yet the crew was new to USAC competition, so any advantage they brought to Team Lotus was unproven. Both time and history have suggested that the Wood brothers were not as much of a secret weapon, quote unquote, as our recollection of the 1965 Indy 500 leads us to believe. The Wood brothers turned 41.9 total seconds on pit road into Team Lotus's dominating win. But the truth is, the Lotus 38's potent blend of aerodynamics, chassis design, and horsepower, when put in the hands of an incredibly talented driver, enabled Ford to win. The Wood brothers' notable contribution at Indianapolis was modifying, oh, that didn't show up, did it? That was a really elaborate, essentially like formula for Bernoulli's principle. Now, I was an English major, and I teach English, and I'm a cultural historian, so I have no clue how to go up there and sort of recreate that formula. But trust me, it was a formula for Bernoulli's principle, which led to the Venturi tube that the Wood brothers added to the gravity-fed fuel tank, the fuel rig that was now required. After getting through USAC inspection with this Venturi tube, the idea that Venturi tube made the fuel flow smoother and faster. But anyway, after getting through USAC inspection, Leonard Wood then devoted several hours to polishing and fitting, making sure all the connections and nozzles worked right to ensure maximum efficiency come race day. Jim Clark had to stop precisely in his box to maximize his refueling strategy. Leonard Wood quoted Clark as saying, "You tell me where to stop, and I'll stop." Wood showed Clark the exact location the crew needed, and the world driving champion, according to Wood, squatted the Lotus 38 down on the exact spot every time. Stops were simpler for the Wood brothers because Clark went the entire 500 miles on a single set of tires. The first stop took only 17 seconds, which is an amazing time given that pit stops during the era typically ran about a minute or so. Colin Chapman was taken aback by the... get that to aim up there. Colin Chapman was taken aback by the efficiency of the Wood brothers. After their first record-breaking stop, Chapman apparently looked over at Glenn Wood. My pages are sticking. And asked, "I say, did you fill it up?" Wood assured him the car was full, and Chapman simply turned away and said, "Jolly good," and away they went. Even the Wood brothers themselves downplayed the significance of their role at Indianapolis in 1965, giving credit not only to Team Lotus and Jim Clark, but to the powerful 4.2-liter double overhead cam Ford motor that took them to victory lane. As Leonard Wood said many years later, it was their engine, so it was all about Ford and what they brought. The Ford Motor Company wanted to gain a stronghold in European-style endurance racing, so they turned to racer-turned-innovator Carroll Shelby for guidance. Not only did Shelby oversee production of the 427 Cobra in 1965, finding a practical use for the high-performance motor, but he also assumed control of the company's GT40 program that had struggled mightily at Le Mans in 1964. At Daytona in February 1965, Carroll Shelby brought a roster of competitive cars and drivers to open the FIA World Sports Car Championship season. Shelby went to Florida with 4 Cobra Daytona Coupes and a pair of brand new GT40s. When the checkered flag fell, Ken Miles and Lloyd Ruby went to victory lane, earning Ford's GT program its first World Sports Car Championship win, taking first place with a 5-lap advantage and setting the stage for the GT40's future success. All in all, Shelby entries that day took 5 of the top 6 finishing positions. The global presence of Shelby and his GT40s and his Cobra Daytona Coupes turned Ford from a pretender into a contender. While Daytona Coupes performed well in World Sports Car competition and won the SCCA's United States GT title in 1964, the cars did even better in 1965, winning not only at Daytona, but also at Sebring, Monza, the Nürburgring, and Reims to take the international championship for GT manufacturers. In November of 1965, Carroll Shelby received a call from Goodyear with an offer. The company had 4 days available to run at the Bonneville Salt Flats, but no viable car. The forecast for weather wasn't good, and the clock was ticking. Art Arfons was preparing to make a record attempt using Firestone tires, and the rules at Bonneville dictated that cars not ready to run had to yield to other competitors. Shelby sent a Daytona Coupe that competed at Le Mans in June to the Salt Flats with a new motor, new Goodyear tires, and the same rear axle ratio used in France. The Shelby entry traveled the 700 miles from California to Utah overnight, and upon getting there, the car wound up setting 25 FIA records. One of the records was when Bobby Tayroe and Craig Breedlove teamed up to run 1,931 miles on the 12-mile Bonneville Loop, and they reached an average speed of 150 miles an hour. No review of motorsports during 1965 would be complete without the Bonneville Salt Flats. The dry lake bed in Utah was a Hemi-friendly environment where the big engine was enthusiastically welcomed. In November, Californian Bob Summers set a world land speed record for wheel-driven vehicles, achieving a 2-pass average of 409.277 in his revolutionary Goldenrod. Car measuring 32 feet long by 48 inches wide. Its frontal area was calculated to be 8.53 square feet with a drag coefficient of 0.1165, making the vehicle literally more aerodynamic than a bullet. Goldenrod was designed by Bill Summers, Bob's brother, using 4 Hemi motors borrowed from Chrysler. The Hemis ran in line, 2 faced front, 2 faced rear, with a 5-speed truck transmission mounted at each end. The entire powertrain linked by custom-built drive shafts. Bill and Bob Summers handcrafted the car's entire chassis, roll cage, and body in a converted vegetable stand in Ontario, California, creating a vehicle that set a land speed record that stood until 2010. In addition to the record Craig Breedlove set in Carroll Shelby's Daytona Coupe, he and Art Arfons, this is Art pictured here with the green monster, they took turns breaking speed barriers in their renowned Battle of the Jet Cars. The rivalry between Breedlove and Arfons actually began in late 1964 when Breedlove's Spirit of America reached 526.28 miles an hour before its parachute failed and the car was wrecked. Art Arfons set a new record about a year later in his Green Monster, which you saw a little bit ago, only to lose it to Breedlove the following week. The one-upsmanship came to a head when Breedlove hit 555.485 on November 2nd, only to be outrun by Arfons on November 7th at 576.553. Breedlove made yet another record attempt on November 15th in his Spirit of America Sonic 1, and this time, the third time, was the charm, as Breedlove's fighter jet-shaped race car broke the 600-mile-an-hour barrier. He hit 600.601 miles an hour, and Craig Breedlove was instantly labeled by the media as America's, quote, astronaut on wheels, end quote. Breedlove's 1965 record stood until Gary Gablich ran 622 in October of 1970. 1965 was populated with an incredible assortment of motorsports talent. Mario Andretti won the 1965 USAC National Championship, taking the title by 610 points over A.J. Foyt. In 1965, Andretti drove roadsters, rear-engine cars, dirt cars, and was named Rookie of the Year at the Indianapolis 500. An example of the young driver's tenacity, at the Trenton 150 in July, Andretti wrecked his Dean Van Line's entry and failed to qualify for the race, and that's Andretti running on the high side in that picture. Even after missing Trenton and including back-to-back DNFs at Milwaukee and DeQuoin, Mario Andretti took the 1965 USAC title with 1 win, 12 top 5s, 13 top 10s, and 3 pole positions. Across the Atlantic, a young Scotsman named Jackie Stewart advanced from Formula 2 to Formula 1, making his first championship start in South Africa and finishing 6th for BRM. His first world championship victory came in the Italian Grand Prix at Monza, where he finished ahead of his teammate Graham Hill. Stewart's rookie season in 1965 was an impressive one as he scored 1 win, 3 seconds, a 3rd, a 5th, and a 6th, performances that put him 3rd for the World Drivers' Championship that year behind Jim Clark and Graham Hill. No review of 1965 would be complete without considering the historic accomplishments of a sheep farmer from Fife named Jim Clark. Jim Clark's modesty was only overshadowed by his immense driving talent. His racing career began in 1958 with road rallies and hill climbs, eventually leading to Formula 2 and then a quick promotion to Formula 1 partway through the 1960 season. Jim Clark won 7 F1 races in 1963 to claim his first world driving title, in addition to finishing 2nd at Indianapolis. At Indy in 1964, Jim Clark started from the pole, but finished 24th. The wee Scot also came perilously close to winning another World Driving Championship that same year. He won the most races in 1964, but struggled with late-season engine problems and finished 2nd behind John Surtees. It was in 1965 that Jim Clark experienced a season that remains, 60 years later, unmatched. Clark not only won the Indy 500, but also his 2nd World Driving Championship with 5 consecutive victories. Jim Clark spent the 1965 Formula One off-season racing against other F1 and regional drivers to win the Tasman Series in Australia and New Zealand, taking the title with one race to go on the schedule. Clark also won the British and the French Formula 2 championships in 1965, making him the first and so far the only driver to win multiple championships in a single year. To his legendary credit, Jim Clark still holds the Formula One record for the most Grand Slams, with 8, his closest competition being Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, who were tied with 6. It is highly unlikely we will ever see another driver who exceeds the success that Jim Clark experienced in 1965. Now, a conceptual foundation that lies beneath the historically significant events of 1965 can help us understand the many levels of meaning we commonly apply to such narratives from our past. As Ocasio, Moscoff, and Steele suggest in their 2016 article in the Academy of Management Review, quote, societal logics serve as the organizing principles for distinct domains of social activity, end quote. The authors theorize that there are, at least 7 societal logics, including the family, religion, the state, the market, professions, community, and the corporation. Now, they continued to explain their idea, and it's one that's actually rooted in organizational studies. They said, and this is a quote, collective memory making is not just a cognitive process, but a social one, generated through communication and dynamic patterns of interaction, and stored in material artifacts and collective consciousness. Each of these societal logics related to motorsports and space exploration, especially with regard to the events of 1965. That year highlighted our shared understanding of family via the Pettys, the Woods, and the Summers, while showcasing the almost religious nature of an event like the Indianapolis 500. The manned space program in 1965 identified the state, as in the United States, through our acknowledgement of professions, like astronauts and engineers, as managed by the corporation, as in, like, say, NASA. For every player in the market, whether it be Ford or Firestone or Goodyear, there's a community of fans, competitors that supports their cause. What makes this history relevant to historians is the fact that societal logics are established through collective memory. Collective memory creates resources we use to better understand and navigate societal logics, which in turn shape cultural identity and institutional legitimacy. Through the lens of collective memory, 1965 emerges not just as a year of remarkable accomplishments, but as a moment when Americans organized their understanding of technology, identity, and ambition. The stories that endure, from Ed White floating above the earth, to Jim Clark dominating Indianapolis, to the Summers Brothers engineering, where'd that go? There we go. Summers Brothers engineering marvels at Bonneville reflect the interplay of societal logics that shape our shared narratives. What we remember of 1965 reveals how technological power becomes cultural power. Rockets, engines, chassis, and speed records gain meaning only when filtered through the stories we tell and retell. Stories that craft identities, legitimize institutions, and shape our understanding of history. Over time, these events have been distilled not simply into facts, but into symbols that express national purpose, corporate competition, and human ambition. I was only an infant in 1965, unaware of the significance unfolding around me, yet the records, the recollections, and the narratives passed down through family, community, and institutions have shaped my understanding of that year. History gains meaning because we give it and ourselves meaning. The human experience, whether on a racetrack, in orbit, or in everyday life, becomes more powerful when it is shared. And with that, I thank you for your time and your attention.
That was terrific, Mark. Questions? I think Eric has a question.
All right, Mark. Ben writes, this is a fascinating talk. You mentioned the collective memory's influence on how we recall the 1965 Indy 500. Do you think there's similar influence on our memory of the space race? It's such a great story of triumph over adversity. I wonder how much is clouded by our desire for everything to fit into that narrative.
That's a great question, because that's something that I'm wrestling with in this manuscript. You know, okay, when the space race started, we, pardon my language, sucked. The United States couldn't do anything right. The Soviets put Sputnik into space, into orbit. We tried to counter with putting our own satellites in space. Most of them blew up on the launch pad, to the point where the national media started to wonder if maybe we were doing the wrong thing and the wrong sort of prioritization, that we should be thinking about other ways to put our technology, because we just couldn't get a satellite in orbit. It took a couple years. We missed out on the first man in space. Gagarin went up first. He went up and went up for 108 minutes and orbited the Earth. We scrambled. About 3 weeks later, Alan Shepard went up, and his time in space was 5 minutes. If you remember Shepard's flight, it was a suborbital hop. He went up and then came down. And the whole flight lasted 15 minutes from liftoff to splashdown. It's a swing and a miss. The Russians are still ahead. Second flight, Gus Grissom, same thing. Up, down. In his case, the hatch blows off the spacecraft while it's in the ocean, fills with water, spacecraft sinks. He gets accused of making a mistake, and it's a whole big kerfluffle. So now, again, swing and a miss. John Glenn goes up. Okay, we're going to orbit the Earth. John Glenn goes up. He gets the go-ahead for 7 orbits. On orbit number 2, there's a problem with, they think, the heat shield, meaning that they're going to have to stop the mission quickly. So instead of doing 7 orbits, they've got what they think's a defective spacecraft. They cut it down to 3, and they bring them back. So right off the bat, I mean, we were struggling. And it seemed like everything we did, the Russians could do a little. Is that whole thing, whatever I could do, you could do better. It was really, the space race was not really going our way at first. But that said, we immortalized Alan Shepard. We immortalized John Glenn. I didn't talk about 1966. That's a whole nother speech. But in 1966, America docks. Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott on Gemini 8 dock with one of those Agena target vehicles. They dock. As soon as they get there, it's about a half hour after they're docked, one of the thrusters on the Gemini spacecraft, it's a steering rocket, activates, short circuits, and puts the thing into a spin to the point where they almost lose consciousness. It's only after they get rid of the Agena that actually makes it worse. They get rid of the Agena and the Gemini spun even faster. And they had to cut that mission short because otherwise they would have passed out and probably died. So right off the bat, we are compartmentalizing a lot of these events and making them collective memory and making them significant history. When, if you match what we did versus what the Soviets did, we weren't that great, but we got better. And finally, we won the space race when Gemini 7, that puts us ahead. We could do things that nobody else could do. Then in December of '68, Apollo 8 goes around the moon, orbits the moon, and that's the end of the space race. We got to the moon first. We didn't land first, but it was a matter of semantics. Who could get there first? And actually, the Russians were in the process of sending a cosmonaut to the moon to orbit. So NASA hurried up and scrambled and said, okay, we're going to change the whole flight routine here. We're going to move this flight up, move this crew back, and we're going to go and Apollo 8 went with an untested Saturn V rocket. No human had ever ridden on a Saturn V rocket, the biggest, most powerful vehicle ever built. But Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders got on top of the thing and went into space because they had to do it. We had to beat the Soviet Union. So I hope that answers Ben's question. it's a whole nother tangent there. Sorry.
Hey, Mark.
Yes.
Mark, I'm over. Hey, it's
Oh,
Lauren
okay.
from
There
Reds.
you are,
Hey,
over there.
Hey, good to see you. Hey, so I think actually my question is maybe even a development on that. So in talking about the societal logics, these collective memories that play together, you know, I'm sort of a historian. I work at a museum. I interpret objects. I interpret material culture from history. And yes, I can observe the collective memory and societal logics and just put the objects in a place that people understand because, hey, it plays into the story you already have as a culture. But actually, how much of my job is bursting that bubble? So for example, most people come in, look at our GT40s and think Ford versus Ferrari. How much is my job talking about Roy Lund and Don Frey? How much of it is actually saying it's not just one guy in a cowboy hat. It was a huge organization, the equivalent of billions of dollars today.
Well, and that's a great point. You know, one thing that doesn't play into this is popular culture. And that adds a whole new wrinkle to it because so much of our collective memory is shaped by not historical fact. We kind of know history a little bit, but we know movies, TV shows, books, and that's what we often use as sort of the guidepost for artifacts and personalities and things like, yeah, I mean, Ford versus Ferrari totally changed our narrative of the GT40 program because it was a hit movie. And it was a fun movie. People went to see it. I remember when the movie came out, the first weekend it came out, I came back to my office and people started coming to my office to say, hey, did you see Ford versus Ferrari? You must have seen Ford versus Ferrari. I saw Ford versus Ferrari. Now, tell me all about it. Was that real? And it's like, you tell me. What did you think was real? What did you get from that was real? Because popular culture often takes it upon itself to sort of recreate fact. You know, this idea of, based on a true story. All these movies that are based on a true story. Well, how do you define that? Is it a true biographical depiction, or is it 5% based on fact? But and artifacts work that way. Especially cars. Race cars are amazing museum exhibits because when you get a race car, as anyone in this room could attest, what car are you getting? Are you getting race cars are in constant states of change. So when somebody comes up and says, here's a car that won such and such an event on this day, it's like, what's the provenance on that? If I'm the archivist or the historian who's going to bring that car into a collection, I want to know, are those the same shocks? Are they the same brakes? Are they the same tires? What has happened to that car from that victory to this point when it's being donated? And I think NASCAR kind of got the jump on that, with the whole Daytona USA thing. The car wins the Daytona 500, it's immediately impounded, even with the confetti and all the stuff on it. The next morning it goes into Daytona USA and it stays there for a year. And it's just what you run is what you brung to the museum. And so in that case, there's a sense of authenticity, and that's kind of like real history. But so much of this other stuff, we kind of play fast and loose with it, and we make it what we want it to be. And that's what a lot of these societal logics do. We can kind of compartmentalize and subdivide what we know and what we experience into these neat packages that we can then share. And they help us understand these complex events. They also help us understand ourselves and where we fit in. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Anyone else have any questions? There's two over here.
This may be a topic for another discussion, but I was just thinking about the amazing influence that the space age had on automotive styling and even industrial products like toasters and things.
Oh yeah. I mean, if it's the whole fins concept. As soon as the jet age rolls around, you start seeing that sort of absorbed by the auto industry. And you start to see concept cars that look more and more like aircraft. The space age was the same way. Anybody drink Tang when they were a kid? You know, there's like no history at all that astronauts drank Tang, but that's how they marketed that for years. It was, this is the drink of the astronauts. And it's like, the astronauts who did drink it just as like a sample kind of thing didn't like it. They didn't want to take it on missions, but General Mills or whoever it was, that's the way they sold it. Astronaut ice cream. Go to a museum and you'll see freeze-dried ice cream. That's what the astronauts eat on the space station. No, it's not. There's no such thing on the space station. Even though what the space station's involved with? Gemini 7 and Gemini 6. What happened when those spacecraft were able to fly in formation for that length of time? That's what led to the International Space Station. We could not have an International Space Station if it weren't for the ability for two vehicles at that speed, at that altitude, to come together and do stuff. And so we forget that. But
We've got time for one more quick question, and then we've got to wrap it up.
My quick question is about the Lotus that won in '65. I'm so used to seeing it appear at events in the UK year after year after year. I was surprised to see it listed as resident at the Henry Ford Museum.
well, you know, the Henry Ford has that whole big section that's devoted to racing now, and that's where the car actually has been kept. But that raises a good question. What's the car that's going around Europe? What's the car that
That's
they've
my
got?
question.
Yeah, what's the car that they're taking to Goodwood and places like that and saying, here's Jim Clark's, Lotus 38. Really? Again, prove it. Is that the one? And I don't know if you noticed too, in the car in the background, that was the Wood Brothers car from this year in honor of Jim Clark's Indy win. They took their stock car for this year, for one of the races for Darlington, and they painted it to look like the Lotus, and they put the number just the way it was. And so, and it even said on the side, it said, Wood Brothers, powered by Ford. It had all the same kind of nomenclature, and it was a slick-looking car. They should have run it more than just at Darlington, but that's on display with Jim Clark's car as kind of a, this was then, here's now. And interestingly enough, it's the Wood Brothers. It's their car. So,
Okay, Mark, that was terrific as always. Thanks everybody for the questions.
thank you. Thank you very much.